This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com, or of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by cinematographer Oliver Curtis, whose work includes Lockwood Company and The Buccaneers, which will be coming out soon. Welcome to the show, Oliver.
Hey, thanks. Good to be here.
I guess my first question is, you got your, like, some of your early work or experience was on big projects like Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho, but also like you did the Bandersnatch Black Mirror, and I'm wondering, like, what were some things, because these are like really unique either directors that you've worked with or unique concepts like the Bandersnatch, and I'm wondering what are some of the things you learned from directors like Edgar Wright, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many directors, so many types of director, you know, that you learn something different every time. When I look back over my career, I worked with so many different types of director, from like Frank Oz, when we did Death at a Funeral, directing comedy. Claire Kilner did a romantic comedy called The Wedding Date. Working with Edgar on the reshoots for Last Night in Soho. Edgar's a very meticulous planner and storyboard, art director. And, you know, so as a cinematographer, you kind of have to do a different dance with different directors. Some directors are very visual and will know how they want to lens a sequence or a scene. Others are much more performance driven and will then look to you to help with the blocking and the structuring of a scene. So you kind of have to do your prep and gauge the kind of dance you're going to do and see what their priorities are and see how you move with them forward and backwards into that space. I mean, I think that's why it's such a fascinating job to be a cinematographer, because, you know, you can be heavily involved in the blocking of a scene, or you can be there to just execute the lighting and the camera move based on what a director has has a preconceived notion of what they're going to do. So it varies enormously, and that's one of the great pleasures of doing what we do, I think.
I've been a camera person for 30 years, and I fell in love with cinema. I heard there was free film school in France, and I wanted to get into the French film school. I really didn't know anything at the time, but I knew at least how to take pictures. So I said, I'll try for the image department. And then when I miraculously got into the French film school, I fell in love with working with the camera. You're following what's going to be in the movie. So that immediacy that the camera allows is what I loved from the beginning. I'm Kirsten Johnson, and this is my course about documentary cinematography.
Well, then let's jump to your work on Lockwood Company. So it's a supernatural detective series, and when I was watching the work you guys, or like that you shot, I'm wondering, like, what were your influences, or what did you look to sort of figure out the way it was going to look?
Yeah, Lockwood Co was a great show to work on, because it's a genre piece in the sense that it's for young adults. It's a ghost story. It's ghost busting, it's Stranger Things, it's Harry Potter. There's so many kind of references you can push and pull through that. But in a way, there were no rules, because it's fantasy. So everything goes in a way. When I met the director, Will McGregor, a lot of his references were from stills and from painting. So we weren't necessarily drawing from pre-existing genre conventions. One thing we were very conscious of is having to integrate the VFX and make them feel embedded and real in that world. So that was something we had to, you know, we were also guided by, this VFX supervisor on that. What we wanted to do is bring in interactive lighting so that the work we were doing in camera had a real impact on what was going to be seen in terms of the ghost work later on. So it's not just shooting live action with actors and then later on they build the ghosts. We'd actually bring in light sources into the spaces, so that would interact with the actors. So you'd have light building on people's faces or on walls, on surfaces. The light source would then be removed in post, and then they would build the ghost elements using our light effects as the foundation for the energy of those creatures. So it was a very interesting process. A lot of Will's references were stills and painting. So it's about darkness and contrast. We were conscious, as I recall, that, you know, it's got to be dark, but also it's television, and, you know, people watch streamers on phones, on pads, and, you know, in conditions where there's a lot of light around. So I think, you know, we were conscious that you want to maintain darkness and mystery and a sense of tension and suspense, but at the same time, you've got to let people in. You know, you've got to let the audience see something, enough of what's going on to draw them into the characters, to draw them into the narrative. So I think that was something we were thinking a lot about, how to walk that line between, you know, mysterious, dark, but not losing too much information when we're building a scene.
Well, it's so interesting because there's like multiple questions from that, because so like the lighting system, because one of my questions literally was from, I think it's episode 2, where the ghost floats over the girl, which is very similar to Ghostbusters, where it floats over Ray. And I was like, oh, but the lights, like, it felt natural the way the light was hitting her from the ghost. So that was part of that lighting system, or the in-camera?
Yeah, there were a number of devices we used. The VFX team had what we called the Schmoo, which is basically a performer dressed up in green, but then covered with an array of LED discs, if you will. And those discs were all fed back to a computer desk and programmed to have various colors and chase sequences and intensity. So that Schmoo person would either move through the room, or we'd have a dummy Schmoo that was moved out on an arm or a rig, and then the lighting would interact, you know, really practically with the surfaces that we were photographing, or the actress on the bed in that case. And then we do a pass, obviously, with the room empty, and then they do all of their LiDAR scanning to recreate what they were missing from behind of the Schmoo when we did that pass. So it was a meticulous process, but what was nice about it is that not just the performers, but the whole crew got a sense of the mood that these things would have, and the sort of how the environment would change, the textures, the colors, the atmosphere of the place. So actually going back to my earlier answer about darkness, once I got a handle on quite how bright or otherwise these things were going to be, it allowed me to take the architectural spaces into a darker area, because you knew that once the ghost sort of emerged from wherever it was going to come from, that light would bring exposure and life to the room itself. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because one of my notes in here is literally, I was going to ask you, because there's sort of this thing where it's like people are shooting really dark to the point where you can't see it, and you're like squinting. And this is one of the things I really appreciated, was it felt like we're in a dark space, but I could still see everything. And there's a scene where I guess it's like a shadow on the wall, and then it turns into the ghosts. And I was wondering, like, did you have, with these Schmoos, did you do a practical with that sort of shadow coming down the stairs and like turning into the ghosts, monsters that sort of chase them in battle?
We will have done passes with a practical element for all of the VFX that get built, whether or not they are integrated, you know, or whether they're used as a foundation or a springboard for the VFX. You sort of leave that to them. But from my experience, all the VFX houses now would prefer you to do something that leaves an imprint, a foundation for them to work with, even if it's just a cue that they'll throw it away, but then they'll move it on in a different direction, rather than just having a plate shot of the staircase or a wall, and then they've got to create it from zero. I think, and I think that's right. I think that, you know, it will only benefit, the final effect will only benefit from some kind of practical or in-camera attempt to emulate or to get a feeling of what you're trying to create. But also, I think that for performance and performers, you know, it gives them something to work with, because otherwise they might, you know, the old days of just performing against a green screen and a tennis ball. You know, it's a rather dry kind of a way to emulate, you know, a special effect.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I noticed, and maybe I'm off on this, but I noticed there's certain scenes had certain color added. So like when the girl's leaving, she goes into that room with all the dead or the other girls' bodies in the hospital beds, and it's like green in the hallway as we go down. Or there's another scene that has a lot of blue in it. What was the thought process behind that? Like, did you have certain colors for certain moments, or how did you guys figure that out?
Well, in the series, they have these things called sort of ghost lights, which are green in the book and in the story. So green is meant to denote a safety color, which is kind of interesting because it's kind of creepy color normally. But so that's part of the playfulness of the show, I think, that they established this green light. So wherever you had a green light, it meant you were relatively safe from attack. What was nice about that is that it meant that our street scenes could have this sort of very unusual tonality. You know, it wasn't just a sodium light or a clean LED or a moonlight. You could have a very mixed palette in an urban environment, and these green sort of washes coming in. And once you knew the vernacular of the show, you could compute that. Oh yeah, it's a ghost light. You know, there's a scene where an assailant or would-be assailant jumps out through a window, and then the gang sort of stick their heads through, and you see that they're just lit with a green front light. Well, that's sort of notionally motivated by these street lights that are dotted around this futuristic London. It was great fun. That I think with saturated colors, you have to be very careful because they can get very muddy if you don't punctuate them with something clean. You know, particularly deep reds and deep blues. You know, digital sensors just kind of don't know what to do with a completely saturated light color, because, you know, the sensor just kind of skews them all off and compartmentalizes them into one area, and you lose some of the sort of nuance of slightly green or desaturated green, or, you know, heavily saturated green. So it's important to be able to paint a frame where a saturated light source is working with a complementary source. So maybe a warm light beyond, or a clean light somewhere else. It just helps the eye, you know, find its way into the image.
So now, what was your relationship then with the colorist in something like this? Like, did you guys do the lights on set and then tweak it in post, like do the colors, I guess, on set and tweak it in post, or were there moments where you had to add the color afterward? Like, what was that relationship with like?
Mostly what we achieved on set was true to, you know, how it finished up. I think a lot of the work we did with a colorist who's Asa Soul at Warner Brothers, is a terrific colorist, was more to do with that balance of contrast and shadow. I think we were very conscious of working there to see how far we could take it into darkness. And what was very refreshing with Joe Cornish, our executive producer, you know, he'd come in and say, "Oh, make it darker," which you virtually never hear now in a grade, you know. So it was really refreshing to have that sort of support and that confidence from the producers to take it further. But yeah, I think the colors we managed, I think, with the gaffer and the production designer to capture in camera very much the palette that we were after.
Now, you've also directed a lot of documentaries for the BBC. So what have you learned from the creative process of making documentaries that you use on fiction? Because I feel like lighting a documentary, it's much more run and gun, and depending on the type of documentary, obviously. Whereas a TV show or a feature, it's going to be much more structured. So is there something you've learned from documentary that you use on your work on TV shows?
Yeah, I think documentaries are a great education in working with very few resources, working quickly and responding to unusual movement or unplanned events. And I think that, you know, everything that I've done in narrative drama has been, you know, helped by my work in documentary. you just learn to look, with a very sort of, open kind of mind, because you don't know necessarily what is going to go on in front of the lens. You have to be able to respond to it and use your creative tools as best you can. It also means that, I traveled a lot with a very limited lighting package, and you have to work with that and not have everything at your disposal. And I've sort of tried to bring that into my narrative work. There are times, particularly like Lockwood Co, where we had a heck load of equipment. You just needed to light up a cemetery or something. Yeah. But my work in documentaries, I think, still pertains, in terms of being able to be inventive with less is more. It's just like, why have 10 lamps when one lamp will do? I think there's a lot to be said for that, and it gives you a clarity of thought. I think it's very good. It's a very good discipline, I think, for people who are coming into the industry, to not feel that one way of working, whether it's in fiction or non-fiction, that they're sort of mutually exclusive. Yeah. I think that they do inform each other, and then you can learn a lot. And in fact, working from, in drama and then going back to documentaries, you can also, it can sort of feed the other way, sort of some osmotic sort of learning. In terms of framing, I think that's something that I've explored a lot. In drama, you might be encouraged to shoot with a great deal of headroom or offsetting to one side. And in documentaries, that's sort of slightly more unusual, to frame in a more modernist or abstract way. But actually, sometimes documentary work can really benefit from having sort of a dramatic eye sort of lent to it, rather than framing in a more conventional televisual way.
Now, you had mentioned earlier when we were talking about Lockwood Co that you guys used very, stills and art and what have you for inspiration. But do you have a lookbook that you just keep for inspiration and things that you really like the lighting of? Is there any particular artists that you go to or tend to lean towards?
I look at paintings a lot, particularly portraitists like Lucian Freud, and then the greats like Caravaggio and Rembrandt. There's a British painter, Joseph Wright of Derby. What's so great about studying painting for what we do in cinema is the amount of time those artists have studied faces is way longer than any of us have ever done. They look and they look and they look at faces, and the way the light plays on faces, the shape of the structure of a face and the body. And so I think you can glean a great deal from studying painting. Also in terms of lighting and contrast, a lot of it impossible to achieve in camera, but you can get a lot of inspiration, I think, from the use of shadow play and contrast and color saturation from some of the greats in painting too. Yeah, so I think painting is as important to me as a reference as cinema. But then in still photography, people like William Eggleston, his use of color and framing is very inspiring. British photographer Martin Parr, who can look at what would look like an ordinary event with a very sort of alien eye and see things afresh, making strange, the everyday. And I think stuff like that is very inspiring to bring into the narrative world in what we do.
Yeah. Is there a particular scene or moment in your work on Lockwood Co that you're really proud of the outcome but was difficult to execute?
Yeah, there was a few, but I think the one that stood out for me, there's two particularly in mind, but one in episode 3, the team go to this big country mansion. It's called Coombe Carey Hall in the story, but it's actually a place called Mentmore Towers. Now, this country house was used by Stanley Kubrick in Eyes Wide Shut. And it's a very user-friendly building, unlike most country houses, certainly in the UK. They're very pristine places. You can't rig anything. You can't do anything to them. You can't bring too much light in. Whereas this place was very malleable, but very big. And so, but we had some great scenes to shoot in the main ballroom, the central atrium of the building. The challenge that I had was that we had day and night scenes to do there. And it's scripted as day when they arrive, sunset and then night. But our schedule only allowed us to work there during the day.
Yeah.
So what the challenge for my lighting team was to, where the windows are very high and very big, they had to build large tents at sort of high level, you know, with wind issues and rain and all the rest of it, and then line them with white and then black, so that we could use them as either a light box for daylight or drop the whites and go for black for nighttime, and also house enough lights in there to be able to create a very believable late afternoon sun source. So that space was particularly challenging, but I think we pulled it off, and we had a heck of a lot of tungsten light in there to get a golden late afternoon glow. We put atmos in there and soil on the floor and cobwebs and everything. Lots of little things that would catch the light and bring the light into the space. The atmosphere there was terrific. I think it worked really well.
So when you say user friendly, was it just that they're more open to letting you guys do things, or was it like just because it was a bigger space, it was easier to rig up?
It was because there weren't any sort of very precious works of art hanging on the wall. There weren't like precious carpets. You know, the art department really went to town on the sort of decaying party kind of feel that was sort of designed in there. It meant that we could really push the boat out in terms of what kind of lights we were going to use. They didn't all have to be low temperature LEDs. We could bring in tungsten sources like park cans and maxi brutes, and you know, for putting a low sun effect in, it's lovely to work with tungsten lights because you can just dim them down and you get beautiful golden glow from them. There's something magical about that. I mean, I certainly used plenty of LED, and I think I had a couple of helium balloons in the ceiling as well to add a soft, cool exposure to the shadows. And then as we transition into the nighttime, we switched to using the overheads rather more, and then go for a strong moonlight source from inside the tent, from outside the window. So it was as I say, it's a malleable space, a very practical space, but quite challenging in terms of the scale, and working at that scale on our schedule. You know, its television schedules are pretty fast, and so you have to plan your days and strategize the best way to achieve what you want to achieve. But yeah, it was a great relief to be in a big country house that allowed us to work in that way.
Now, my last question for you, is there a favorite guilty pleasure film or TV show that you like to watch?
Yeah, it's less of a guilty pleasure, I suppose. It's just things that I enjoy watching at the moment. I mean, Succession is terrific to watch, and the series The Bear is set in Chicago. It's been wonderful. It's interesting because they're not, the cinematography on both of them is exemplary. I mean, the work there is amazing, but it's kind of invisible, and I kind of like that because they're so performance driven, and yet the cinematography has to work so well with that kind of approach. It has to be seamless and invisible, and it blends so well with what's being said, and the movement and the energy of those shows. And they really appeal to me. I'm really enjoying those shows. Succession, I'm afraid, is coming to an end. I'm looking forward to season 2 of The Bear, but that's been a wonderful show to watch. Yeah, it's
a great show. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.
And that's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com, or of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching. This video is made possible by our sponsors, AJA. We'd like to thank AJA for all their support and tell you to go to aja.com for all your production and post-production needs.